The wagon wheel groaned under its burden as Penelope Grant wrestled her traveling workshop through the rutted streets of Pendleton, Oregon. Her calloused hands gripping the reins while dusty afternoon light painted the Umatilla River Valley in shades of amber and rust. It was June of 1873, and she had been mending pots and pans across the Western Territories for 5 years now. Ever since her father's death had left her alone at 18 with nothing but his tools and the knowledge he had hammered into her capable hands. The frontier needed fixers, people who could breathe life back into cracked kettles and dented coffee pots. And Penelope had learned that survival meant becoming indispensable to communities that could barely afford new goods shipped from the East. She guided her mule down Main Street, passing the saloon where piano music leaked through swinging doors, the general store with its false front painted optimistic white, and the blacksmith shop where sparks flew like fireflies in the dimming light. Pendleton was growing, fed by wheat farmers and cattle ranchers who were taming the rolling grasslands that stretched endlessly toward distant blue mountains. She had been here twice before, and both times the townsfolk had kept her busy from dawn until dusk with their damaged cookware and broken tools. Penelope set up her workspace in the lot beside the livery stable, just as she had done on previous visits. The stable owner, a German immigrant named Herman, waved at her from the barn door, his weathered face creasing into a welcoming smile. She unhitched her mule, a patient creature named Daisy, and began arranging her anvil, her various hammers, her soldering iron, and the small forge she would fire up come morning. Everything had its place in her ordered world, each tool an extension of her will, each repair a small act of resurrection. The sun was setting behind the Blue Mountains when she finished her preparations. She had just started a small cooking fire beside her wagon when she heard boots crunching on the gravel behind her. Turning, she found a man standing at the edge of her campsite, hat in his hands, shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of bone-deep weariness. He was perhaps 25, with dark hair that curled against his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds over the high desert. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a faded red shirt that had seen better days, and boots scuffed nearly white at the toes. But it was his face that caught her attention, the hollowness in his cheeks, the shadows beneath his eyes, the look of a man who had forgotten what it meant to hope. "You the tinker?" he asked, his voice rough as gravel. "I am," Penelope replied, wiping her hands on her canvas apron. "Penelope Grant, I mend what is broken." He stepped closer into the circle of firelight, and she saw the coffee pot he carried, its handle hanging loose, its spout dented nearly flat. "Found this in the bunkhouse," he said. "Belonged to my brother. He died 3 months back. Trail accident." Stampede caught him wrong. Penelope heard the weight of unsaid things in those clipped sentences. She took the coffee pot from his hands, examining it with practiced eyes. "I can fix this," she said gently. "Have it ready by tomorrow afternoon." The cowboy nodded but did not leave. He stood there in the firelight, turning his hat in his hands, working up to something. Finally, he looked at her directly, and the pain in his eyes nearly stole her breath. "They say you can fix anything," he said. "Mend anything that is broken." "Pots and pans," Penelope replied carefully. "Tools and such. Metalwork." "What about people?" The question came out barely above a whisper. "What about a man who cannot sleep without seeing his brother's face, who cannot ride through a herd without his hands shaking, who feels like something inside him got trampled right along with the body they buried?" Penelope set the coffee pot down on the tailgate of her wagon. Around them, Pendleton was settling into evening, lamps being lit in windows, voices calling good night, a dog barking somewhere down by the river. She looked at this broken man standing before her and felt something shift in her chest, some locked door creaking open. "What is your name?" she asked. "Quinn Garrison," he said. "Most folks call me Quinn." "Sit down, Quinn," she said, gesturing to the log she had dragged near her fire. "Tell me about your brother." He hesitated, as though unaccustomed to the invitation. But something in her steady gaze must have reassured him, because he lowered himself onto the log and stared into the flames. Penelope poured coffee from her own battered pot and handed him a tin cup. He wrapped his hands around it like it was the only solid thing in a shifting world. "His name was Thomas," Quinn began, and the story spilled out of him like water from a cracked vessel. Thomas had been 2 years younger, 21 when he died, full of laughter and dreams of saving enough money to buy a small ranch of his own. They had signed on with a cattle outfit driving a herd from Texas up through Colorado and into Oregon. Brutal work, but honest pay. Everything had been going well until they hit rough country in southern Oregon, rocky terrain where the cattle got spooked by a mountain lion. The stampede had been sudden and vicious, 1,000 head of panicked livestock running blind. Thomas had been trying to turn the leaders when his horse stumbled. They found him 2 hours later, trampled beyond recognition, except for the silver belt buckle his mother had given him on his 16th birthday. Quinn talked until his coffee was cold, words he had clearly been holding in for months tumbling out in the presence of this strange woman who mended broken things. Penelope listened without interrupting, her face still in the firelight, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. She understood grief, had wrestled with it herself when her father died. But her father had been old, his heart worn out from years of hard work. Quinn's brother had been young, full of unlived life. "I keep thinking I should have been faster," Quinn said finally, his voice cracking. "Should have turned his horse before mine. Should have seen the ground was bad. Should have done something different." "You would have died too," Penelope said quietly. "And then your brother's death would have no witness, no one to remember him, no one to carry his story forward." Quinn looked at her sharply. "That's supposed to make me feel better." "No," she said. "Nothing makes it better, but maybe over time it makes it bearable." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. Somewhere in the livery stable, horses moved in their stalls, and from the saloon came the faint sound of someone playing a fiddle, mournful and sweet. "The coffee pot," Quinn said abruptly. Thomas was particular about his coffee, made it strong enough to strip paint. "Used that pot every morning without fail." He paused, rubbing his face with one calloused hand. "Fool thing to care about, I suppose. It is just a piece of tin." "It is not foolish," Penelope said. "It was his and now it is yours, and fixing it is a way of honoring him. That is not foolish at all." Quinn looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. "You talk different than most folks around here." "My father believed in the power of words properly used," Penelope said. "He taught me to read before I could walk practically. Said that a good tinker needed to understand the world, not just the metal." "Where is your father now?" "Dead these 5 years," she said simply. "Heart gave out in Salt Lake City. I buried him there and kept moving. It is what he would have wanted. You've been traveling alone all that time." Quinn's voice held a note of concern. "I have," Penelope said. "I can shoot straight and I know which towns to avoid. Mostly people are decent, especially when you offer a service they need." Quinn stood, setting his cup down on a flat stone near the fire. "I should let you rest. You have had a long day, I expect." "Wait," Penelope said, surprising herself. She stood as well, suddenly aware of how tall he was, how broad his shoulders despite the weight of grief he carried. "You said you cannot sleep. Do you have anywhere you need to be tomorrow?" "I am between jobs," Quinn admitted. "Finished the cattle drive last month. Been taking odd work around Pendleton trying to figure out what comes next. Then come back tomorrow morning, Penelope said. Early. I could use help with some of the heavier repairs. And sometimes talking while working keeps the dark thoughts at bay. Quinn studied her face in the firelight, searching for something. Whatever he found must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. What time? Sunrise. I will be here. He settled his hat back on his head, touching the brim in a gesture that belonged to an older, more courteous time. Thank you, Miss Grant. Penelope, she said. Just Penelope. Then just Quinn, he replied, and she caught the ghost of a smile on his lips before he turned and walked away into the darkness. Penelope stood by her fire long after he disappeared, staring into the flames and wondering what had possessed her to invite a grieving stranger into her carefully controlled world. She had learned over the years to keep people at a distance, to be friendly but not familiar, helpful but not involved. Getting attached to anyone in particular towns was dangerous when her life was one of constant motion. Yet something about Quinn Garrison's raw honesty had reached past her defenses. She banked the fire and climbed into her wagon, where a narrow bed waited among the tools and supplies. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it arrived, it brought dreams of storm-colored eyes and voices asking to be made whole. True to his word, Quinn appeared as the sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Penelope was already stoking her forge, building the fire hot enough for soldering. She looked up at the sound of his approach and felt that strange flutter in her chest again, quickly suppressed. Morning, Quinn said, and his voice sounded steadier than it had the night before, as though unburdening himself had provided some small relief. Morning, Penelope replied. There is coffee in the pot if you want it. Quinn poured himself a cup and stood watching her work the bellows, bringing the coals to white-hot intensity. The day was already warming, promising the kind of heat that would make working over the forge uncomfortable by midday. What do you need me to do? He asked. Penelope pointed to a stack of pots and pans that local residents had already dropped off. Sort those by what is wrong with them. Handles that need reattaching in one pile, dents in another, holes that need patching in a third. Can you tell the difference? I have cooked over enough campfires to know when a pot is past saving, Quinn said, setting down his coffee and rolling up his sleeves. They worked in companionable silence as the town woke around them. Herman opened the livery stable, releasing horses into the corral where they kicked up dust and greeted the morning with pleased whinnies. Wagons began rolling past on Main Street, farmers heading to the mill with their wheat, ranch hands riding out to check on cattle scattered across the grassland ranges. The blacksmith fired up his forge, the clang of his hammer on anvil providing counterpoint to Penelope's lighter, more delicate tapping. Quinn proved to be a quick study, sorting the damaged cookware efficiently, and even making observations about which repairs would be most challenging. Penelope found herself explaining her techniques, showing him how to heat solder to just the right temperature, how to shape dented metal back to something approaching its original form without stressing it to the breaking point. It is like coaxing rather than forcing, she said, demonstrating on a copper pot with a significant dent in its side. The metal wants to remember its shape. You just have to remind it gently. My brother would have liked you, Quinn said suddenly, watching her hands as they worked. He appreciated people who were good at things. Used to say the world needed more folks with actual skills and fewer with just opinions. He sounds like he was wise. He was better than me in most ways, Quinn said, his voice going rough again. Kinder, more patient. People liked him immediately. I have always been too quiet, too serious. Thomas could walk into a room and make friends before the door closed behind him. Penelope set down her hammer and looked at Quinn directly. "You are kind enough to ask a stranger how to mend what is broken inside you. That takes more courage than being liked in a room." Quinn held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then a woman's voice broke the spell, calling out a greeting as she approached with a cast-iron skillet in her hands. The day proceeded in a steady stream of customers bringing damaged goods and collecting repaired items. Penelope worked quickly and efficiently, her hands sure on the tools, her mind focused on each task. Quinn stayed beside her, learning the rhythm of her work, anticipating what she would need next, holding pieces steady while she soldered or hammered. They developed an unspoken understanding, the kind that usually took weeks to build. During a lull in the mid-afternoon, Penelope pulled Thomas's coffee pot from where she had set it aside and began working on it with particular care. Quinn watched without speaking as she straightened the spout, reattached the handle with neat silver solder, worked out several small dents he had not even noticed. When she was finished, she polished it until it gleamed. "Good as new," she said, handing it to him. Quinn turned the coffee pot in his hands, examining her work. His throat worked as he swallowed hard. "It is perfect. What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Penelope said. "Consider it payment for your help today." "That is not right. Your work is worth something." "Then pay me by coming back tomorrow," Penelope said, the words escaping before she could reconsider them. "I will be here another week at least, and I genuinely could use the help. I will pay you fair wages." Quinn looked at her searchingly. "You do not know anything about me." "I could be unreliable, could be a drunk or worse." "Are you?" Penelope asked. "No." "Then come back tomorrow." Quinn nodded slowly, still holding the coffee pot like it was made of something more precious than tin. "I will be here at sunrise." As he walked away, Penelope realized she was smiling, a genuine expression of pleasure that felt strange on her face after years of carefully maintained professional distance. Herman caught her eye from across the stable yard and grinned knowingly, but she ignored him and returned to her work. The pattern repeated itself over the following days. Quinn arrived each morning as the sun rose, staying until evening shadows stretched long across the lot. They worked side by side, talking sometimes, silent others, building something that felt almost like friendship but contained undercurrents neither of them acknowledged out loud. Penelope learned that Quinn had been born in Missouri, the son of a schoolteacher mother and a father who had died at Shiloh before Quinn was old enough to remember him. Thomas had been born a year after the war ended, a balm to their mother's grief. They had grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, both boys eager to escape to the wider world. At 18, Quinn had headed west, working as a ranch hand, a freight wagon guard, and eventually a cowboy on the long cattle drives. Thomas had followed at 16, lying about his age to get hired on the same outfit. "Mama died the winter before we left on that last drive," Quinn said one afternoon, his hands busy smoothing a dented pot. "Fever took her fast. Thomas took it hard. I think he threw himself into the work to avoid feeling it." "And you?" Penelope asked gently. "I had already gotten good at not feeling things," Quinn admitted. "Years of practice, but losing Thomas broke something open. I cannot seem to shut it again." "Maybe you are not supposed to," Penelope said. She was working on a delicate repair, reattaching a decorative copper handle to a serving dish. "Maybe feeling things is not a weakness." Quinn was quiet for a long moment. "My whole life, I have been told that men do not cry, do not mourn, do not break. We just keep moving forward." "And how is that working for you?" The question, asked without judgment, made Quinn laugh, a short bark of sound that held more pain than humor. "Not well, as you might have noticed." My father cried when my mother died, Penelope said. I was 7. He sat in his workshop and sobbed like his heart was being torn out, and I stood in the doorway not knowing what to do. Finally, he looked up and saw me there, and he held out his arms. I ran to him, and we cried together. Later, he told me that tears were not weakness. They were proof that love was real, that loss mattered, that we were human and not just machines going through motions. Your father sounds like he was a good man. He was, Penelope said softly. Not perfect, but good. He taught me everything I know. Sometimes I hear his voice in my head when I am working, guiding my hands. Do you ever wish you had stayed somewhere? Quinn asked. Put down roots instead of wandering. Every town I visit, someone asks me that, Penelope said. Usually followed by an offer of marriage from some widower who needs a woman to cook and clean. She kept her voice light, but there was an edge to it. They see my skills and think I would make a useful wife. That is not what I was suggesting, Quinn said quickly. I know, Penelope said, meeting his eyes. You are asking something different, whether I am lonely, whether this life satisfies me. The answer is complicated. I love my work. I love the freedom of the road, the variety of places and people. But yes, sometimes in the evening when I am alone in my wagon, I wonder what it would be like to have someone to talk to share the small moments with. You are talking to me now, Quinn pointed out. Yes, Penelope said, and something in her voice made him look at her more intently. I am. The air between them felt suddenly charged, heavy with possibility. Quinn set down the pot he had been working on and took a step toward her, his expression serious. Penelope, he began, but before he could continue, a commotion erupted on Main Street. A wagon had thrown a wheel, spilling its load of grain sacks across the road. The driver was shouting for help, and several men were already running to assist. Quinn hesitated, torn between whatever he had been about to say and the clear need for help. Go, Penelope said. We can talk later. Quinn nodded and jogged toward the accident, his long strides eating up the distance. Penelope watched him go, her heart beating faster than the simple, interrupted conversation warranted. She pressed a hand to her chest, willing her pulse to slow, then forced herself to return to her work. But concentration eluded her. She found herself watching Quinn as he helped right the wagon, his strength evident in the way he lifted the heavy grain sacks as though they weighed nothing. Other women were watching too, she noticed, their eyes appreciative. Quinn Garrison was an attractive man, and in a frontier town where men outnumbered women significantly. An unmarried cowboy with honest ways and a strong back would be considered quite a catch. The thought sent an unexpected spike of something that felt uncomfortably like jealousy through Penelope's chest. She had no claim on Quinn. They had known each other less than a week. He had come to her broken, seeking repair, and she had offered what comfort she could. That was all. Except it was not all, and she knew it. By the time Quinn returned, Penelope had regained her composure. They worked until evening as usual, the easy companionship re-established, the charged moments seemingly forgotten. But that night, lying in her wagon bed, Penelope could not stop thinking about the way Quinn had looked at her, the word he had started to say, the possibility hanging unspoken between them. She had been alone for so long, self-sufficient and proud of it. The thought of depending on another person, of opening her heart to the inevitable pain that came with attachment, terrified her. Yet the thought of Quinn walking away, of never seeing him again once she left Pendleton, felt somehow worse. The next morning, Quinn arrived before sunrise, earlier than usual. Penelope was already up, unable to sleep, and she had coffee ready. They drank in the pre-dawn darkness, both of them unusually quiet. I have been thinking, Quinn said finally, his voice rough in the stillness. About what you said, about how you sometimes wonder what it would be like to have someone to share things with. Penelope's heart began to pound. Yes, I have been wondering the same thing, Quinn continued, staring into his coffee cup as though it held answers. Especially since Thomas died. The loneliness is worse than the grief sometimes. Like there is this hole inside me that nothing fills. I know that feeling, Penelope admitted. Quinn looked up, meeting her eyes in the growing light. When you leave Pendleton, where do you go next? Baker City, Penelope said. It is about 100 miles southeast, then on to Boise, maybe down to Nevada before winter. Alone, Quinn said, not quite a question, as always. What if you were not alone? The words hung between them, heavy with implication. What if someone traveled with you? Helped with the work, shared the road, Penelope's breath caught. Quinn, what are you asking? He set down his coffee and stood, moving closer to where she sat on the wagon tailgate. The sun was rising now, painting his face in gold, highlighting the hope and fear warring in his expression. I am asking if you would let me come with you, he said. Not as a hired hand, not as someone you are trying to fix. As a partner. Someone who wants to know you, really know you. Someone who thinks maybe we are both less broken when we are together. You do not know me, Penelope whispered, though her heart was singing yes, yes, yes. Not really. We have known each other a week. I know that you are kind without being soft, Quinn said. I know that you are strong without being hard. I know that when you focus on your work, you bite your lower lip. I know that you take your coffee with one sugar and that you hum sometimes when you think no one is listening. I know that you have been alone too long, just like me, and that maybe, possibly, we could be less alone together. Penelope stood, bringing them face to face, so close she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. This is crazy. People do not do this. We hardly know each other. People do this all the time on the frontier, Quinn countered. Mail-order brides marry men they have never met. Folks partner up for survival and figure out the rest as they go. At least we like each other. At least we have talked honestly. That is more than most start with. And if it does not work, Penelope asked, voicing her deepest fear, if we are wrong and we end up hating each other, then we figure it out like adults, Quinn said. But Penelope, I do not think we are wrong. I think you feel this too, this sense that something important is happening here. She did feel it. From the moment Quinn had walked into her firelight carrying his brother's broken coffee pot, she had felt the tug of connection, the recognition of a kindred soul. But admitting it meant risking everything she had built, the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. I am afraid, she whispered. So am I, Quinn admitted. I am terrified, but I am more afraid of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Penelope looked up at him, this man who had been a stranger just days ago, who now felt essential as breathing. She thought about her father, who had loved her mother with fierce devotion. She thought about the years of loneliness, of keeping herself carefully apart. She thought about the way her heart felt lighter when Quinn was near, how the silence between them was comfortable rather than empty. Yes, she said, the word barely audible. Then louder, stronger. Yes, come with me, be my partner. Let us see what we can build together. The smile that broke across Quinn's face was like sunrise, chasing away shadows that had lived there too long. He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away, and when she did not, he cupped her face in his calloused hands. I am going to kiss you now, he said, if that is all right. It is more than all right, Penelope said, and then his lips were on hers, gentle and questioning. She answered by wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, letting the kiss deepen into something that promised future intimacies. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. I think I have been looking for you my whole life, he said roughly. "I think I have been running from you," Penelope replied, "but I am done running." They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the sun climbed higher and Pendleton woke around them. Eventually, practical concerns reasserted themselves. They had work to do, arrangements to make. Quinn would need to collect his few belongings from the boarding house where he had been staying. Penelope would need to prepare her wagon for two instead of one, figure out new logistics. But first, they sat together by the fire and talked about the future, making plans and dreaming aloud. Quinn proved to have a good head for business, suggesting routes that would take them to mining camps where metalwork was desperately needed and money flowed freely. Penelope shared her knowledge of which towns were welcoming and which were best avoided, which merchants were honest and which tried to cheat. "We could save up," Quinn said thoughtfully. "Eventually buy a piece of land, build a proper workshop. Still travel during good weather but have a home base to return to." "I've never had a real home," Penelope said, the idea both thrilling and frightening. "Not since my father died." "Then we will make one," Quinn said simply. "Together." The week passed in a blur of work and stolen moments. They repaired what felt like every pot and pan in Umatilla County, Quinn's presence allowing Penelope to take on larger jobs. He proved adept at the heavier work, while her skill with detail and precision ensured quality results. They were a good team, complementing each other's strengths. Word spread that the tinker had taken on a partner, and there was plenty of speculation about the nature of their relationship. Penelope and Quinn ignored the gossip, though Quinn made sure to be respectful of her reputation, sleeping in the livery stable rather than near her wagon. But everyone could see the way they looked at each other, the way they moved in synchrony, the quiet intimacy of their conversations. On their last evening in Pendleton, Herman invited them to dinner with his family. His wife Martha was a plump, cheerful woman who fussed over Penelope like a mother hen, while their 3 children regarded Quinn with awe typically reserved for frontier heroes. "You take good care of her," Martha told Quinn seriously as they were leaving. "She is alone in this world, and that is a hard thing for a woman." "She will never be alone again," Quinn promised, and the certainty in his voice made Penelope's eyes sting with unexpected tears. They left Pendleton at dawn on a perfect June morning, the wagon packed and Daisy the mule pulling steadily. Quinn rode beside the wagon on a sturdy bay gelding he had purchased with his saved wages, his few possessions tied behind the saddle. As they followed the road southeast toward Baker City, Penelope felt as though she were embarking on an entirely new life. The journey took 4 days, traveling through country that alternated between pine forests and open grassland. They saw herds of antelope in the distance, and once, a black bear that watched them from a rocky outcrop before ambling away. At night, they camped under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch, and Quinn taught Penelope the names of constellations his mother had shown him as a boy. They talked endlessly, sharing histories and dreams, fears and hopes. Penelope learned that Quinn had a dry sense of humor hidden beneath his serious exterior, that he could cook surprisingly well for a cowboy, that he had gentle hands despite their calluses and scars. Quinn discovered that Penelope had a temper when tired, that she could out-stubborn a mule when she believed she was right, that she sang beautifully when she thought no one was listening. They also learned that attraction, already strong, could grow into something that made sleeping separately increasingly difficult. But Quinn insisted on propriety until they could be properly married, a stance Penelope found both frustrating and endearing. "I want to do this right," he said one evening when the tension between them was nearly unbearable. "I want to honor you, honor what we are building. That means waiting until it is legal and blessed." "You are infuriatingly honorable," Penelope said, but she kissed him anyway, long and deep, a promise of what was to come. Baker City proved to be a booming mining town, rough and ready, full of men with gold dust in their pockets and a desperate need for services of all kinds. Penelope and Quinn set up in a lot near the center of town and were immediately swamped with work. In addition to pots and pans, miners brought picks and shovels that needed reshaping, lanterns requiring repair, even jewelry that needed mending or resizing. On their third day in Baker City, Quinn accompanied Penelope to the general store for supplies. The proprietor, a shrewd-eyed man named Samuel Green, regarded them with interest. "Word is you two are traveling together," he said, making it a question. "We are," Penelope confirmed. "She your wife?" "Not yet," Quinn said, his hand finding Penelope's. "But soon if she will have me properly." "I will," Penelope said, smiling up at him. Samuel nodded approvingly. "Judge comes through next week. He could make it official if you wanted." They looked at each other, a whole conversation happening in the space of a glance. Then Quinn squeezed her hand and said, "We would like that very much." The week passed in a flurry of preparation. Martha had sent Penelope away from Pendleton with a dress that had belonged to her daughter, a simple but pretty calico in deep blue that she insisted was perfect for a wedding. Quinn had his one good shirt cleaned and pressed, and bought a new string tie at the general store. They were not wealthy, but they had enough saved to start their married life on solid footing. The judge, a portly man named Hornsby, arrived on schedule and agreed to perform the ceremony in the evening after he had dealt with the legal matters that had brought him to Baker City. Word spread quickly, as news always did in small towns, and by the time Penelope and Quinn stood before Judge Hornsby in the lot where they worked, a surprisingly large crowd had gathered to witness the wedding. Penelope wore the blue calico dress with her mother's locket around her neck, her dark hair braided and pinned up. Quinn stood beside her in his clean shirt and new tie, his hair slicked back, his eyes never leaving her face. They held hands as Judge Hornsby led them through the simple vows, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they both lived. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Quinn kissed Penelope with such tenderness that several women in the crowd sighed audibly. Then the impromptu celebration began, someone producing a fiddle, another a harmonica, whiskey appearing from various pockets. They danced in the dusty lot under strings of lanterns that miners hung from poles, Quinn holding Penelope close and whispering in her ear all the things he had been too honorable to say before. Finally, well after midnight, they escaped to the wagon that was now their marriage bed. Quinn lifted Penelope over the threshold as though she weighed nothing, setting her gently on the narrow bunk. The space was cramped and far from luxurious, but neither of them cared. "Hello, wife," Quinn said softly, his hands gentle as he began unpinning her hair. "Hello, husband," Penelope replied, her fingers working the buttons of his shirt. What followed was sweet and awkward and perfect, two people learning each other with patience and growing confidence. Quinn was as gentle as Penelope had known he would be, attentive to her responses, checking constantly that she was comfortable. She had not known it could be like this combination of physical pleasure and emotional connection. When they finally lay tangled together in the aftermath, both breathless and smiling, Penelope felt as though some final piece of her soul had clicked into place. "I love you," Quinn said, his voice rough with emotion. "I should have said it before, but I was afraid of being too much, too soon. But I love you, Penelope. I think I have loved you since you told me that feeling things was not weakness." "I love you too," Penelope whispered, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "I fought it at first because it terrified me, but yes, I love you, completely." They fell asleep wrapped in each other, the sounds of the mining town fading into peaceful silence. The following months established the pattern of their new life together. They traveled from town to town, building a reputation as the tinker team that could fix anything. Quinn handled much of the heavy work and the business negotiations, while Penelope focused on the intricate repairs that required her finer touch. They were successful beyond what either had managed alone, saving money steadily toward the dream of permanent land and a workshop. But more than financial success, they found profound happiness in each other's company. Quinn's grief over Thomas never disappeared entirely, but it softened, becoming something he could carry without it crushing him. Penelope discovered that sharing her life did not diminish her independence, but rather enhanced it, giving her someone to celebrate successes with and lean on during difficulties. They made love often, learning each other's bodies with increasing skill and confidence. In the privacy of their wagon, they could be completely themselves, vulnerable and open in ways neither had ever been with anyone else. Quinn loved how Penelope became fierce in her passion, all the control she maintained during the day melting away in his arms. Penelope adored how tender Quinn remained even in his desire, always making sure she found pleasure before seeking his own. By October, when they reached Boise, Idaho territory, Penelope was fairly certain she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice and was experiencing morning sickness that made working over the forge challenging. She waited another 2 weeks to be sure before telling Quinn, anxious about how he would react to such news when they were still living in a wagon. She told him one evening as they were finishing dinner, her heart pounding with nervousness. Quinn's fork clattered to his plate, and for a moment he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then joy broke across his face like sunlight after rain. "A baby," he said, his voice cracking. "We are having a baby." "Yes," Penelope confirmed, relief flooding through her at his reaction. "Come spring, I think." Quinn pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. When he released her, there were tears on his cheeks, and he was not ashamed of them. "Thank you," he said fervently. "Thank you for giving me this, for giving us this. I know it makes things complicated with the traveling and the work, but we will figure it out. I promise we will figure it out." "We will need to settle somewhere before the baby comes," Penelope said. "I cannot give birth in a wagon on the road." "Then we settle," Quinn said simply. "We have enough saved to buy land. Maybe not a lot, but enough for a cabin and a workshop. We can do this, Penelope. We can build our home." They discussed options and decided that Pendleton made the most sense. They knew the area, had friends there in Herman and Martha, and it was positioned well for continuing the tinker business while having a home base. They would finish out their current circuit, working through the winter as long as Penelope felt able, then return to Pendleton in early spring to establish themselves permanently. The pregnancy was generally easy, though Penelope tired more quickly and had to be careful about the fumes from soldering. Quinn became fiercely protective, taking over the more dangerous aspects of the work and insisting she rest whenever she showed signs of fatigue. She grumbled about his hovering but secretly loved how attentive he was, how he would rest his hand on her growing belly and talk to the baby about everything and nothing. They spent Christmas in a small town in northern Nevada, where a wealthy mine owner hired them to restore a collection of copper cookware his wife had brought from Boston. The job paid extremely well and took 3 weeks, enough time to rest and prepare for the journey back to Oregon. In January, they began the trip north, taking it slowly due to Penelope's condition and the winter weather. The journey was harder than their previous travels, with snow and cold testing their resolve. But Quinn proved to be an excellent partner in adversity, keeping their spirits up and taking care of all the heavy work. They reached Pendleton in late February, when the first hints of spring were greening the grasslands. Herman and Martha welcomed them back with open arms, exclaiming over Penelope's obvious pregnancy, and immediately offering help in finding suitable land. It took 2 weeks of searching, but they finally found a perfect spot a mile outside of town, 5 acres with a creek running through it and a view of the Blue Mountains. There was no structure yet, but the previous owner had cleared part of the land and dug a good well. Quinn purchased it with cash saved from their months of work, and they began immediately building a cabin. The community rallied to help, as frontier communities did. Neighbors showed up for a barn raising that was actually a cabin raising, men working together to erect the walls and roof, while women brought food and kept everyone fed. In 3 days, they had a solid 1-room cabin with a loft, a stone fireplace, and good windows that let in light. It was simple but well built, tight against wind and rain. Quinn built the workshop next, a sturdy structure where Penelope could safely work after the baby came. He installed a proper forge with good ventilation, built workbenches at heights comfortable for her, organized her tools on the walls where everything was easily accessible. It was the finest workspace she had ever had, designed specifically for her needs by someone who understood and valued her work. Their son was born on a warm evening in early May, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being evicted from his comfortable womb. Penelope labored for 8 hours with Martha attending her, and Quinn pacing outside, occasionally allowed in to hold her hand and whisper encouragement. When Martha finally called him in to meet his son, Quinn cried unashamedly, holding the tiny baby with such care and wonder that Penelope fell in love with him all over again. They named him Thomas Quinn Garrison, honoring the brother who would never meet his nephew but whose death had brought his parents together. Little Thomas had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and from the first day, he had both of them wrapped firmly around his tiny fingers. Parenthood was exhausting and terrifying, and more wonderful than either Penelope or Quinn had imagined. They took turns walking Thomas when he was fussy at night, shared diaper duty without complaint, marveled together over every small developmental milestone. Penelope's work slowed but did not stop. She simply brought Thomas to the workshop in a basket, where he would sleep or gurgle happily while she repaired pots and pans. Quinn took steady work at a nearby ranch, which provided reliable income to supplement Penelope's tinker business. He would ride out before dawn and return by dusk, always eager to scoop up his son and hear about Penelope's day. Their life was busy and sometimes chaotic, but it was theirs, built together from grief and hope and stubborn love. Thomas was 6 months old when a cowboy came to their door one evening, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. He introduced himself as Jack Morrison, and he had ridden with Quinn and Thomas Garrison on that fatal cattle drive. "I heard you were here," Jack said, his eyes flicking to Quinn. "Heard you had gotten married, had a baby boy, named him after your brother." "That is right," Quinn said, his hand finding Penelope's. "This is my wife, Penelope. Penelope, Jack was one of the hands on the drive." "I have been carrying something that belonged to Thomas," Jack said, pulling a small bundle from his pocket. "His personal effects were divided up after the accident. Most went to the trail boss to send to your mother, but I ended up with this. When I heard she had passed too, I did not know what to do with it. Figured I would hang on to it until I could find you." He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a silver watch on a chain. Quinn sucked in a breath, reaching out with shaking hands. "This was our father's," he said quietly. "I thought it had been lost in the stampede. Thomas was wearing it that day." "It was in his vest pocket," Jack said. Dented but still working, if you can believe it, like it was protected somehow. Quinn opened the watch, and a small photograph fell out, a tintype of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Their mother, young and healthy, nothing like the worn woman grief and illness had made her. "Thank you," Quinn said roughly. "You cannot know what this means, having this piece of him back." Jack nodded, shuffled his feet. "He was a good man, your brother. Best bunkmate I ever had. Always willing to share what he had. I think about him sometimes, wonder what he would be doing now if things had gone different." "He would probably be working on a ranch somewhere, courting some pretty girl," Quinn said, a sad smile on his face. "He always wanted his own place eventually, land and cattle and a big family." "Well, he has got a nephew now who will know his name," Jack said, glancing at the baby in Penelope's arms. "That is something. That is better than being forgotten." After Jack left, Quinn sat by the fire holding the watch, running his thumb over the dented case. Penelope moved to sit beside him, Thomas drowsing against her shoulder. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. "I am," Quinn said, and he sounded surprised. "It hurts remembering, but it is a clean hurt now, not the ragged wound it was. I can think about Thomas and smile at the memories instead of drowning in guilt." "You have healed," Penelope said. "Not completely, maybe. I do not think we ever heal completely from losing people we love, but enough to be happy again." "I told you once that you could mend anything," Quinn said, setting the watch carefully on the mantel. "I asked you to mend my broken spirit with your skillful heart, and you did, Penelope. You really did." "We mended each other," Penelope corrected, leaning against him. "I was just as broken as you, just in different ways. We put each other back together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire, their son breathing softly between them. Outside, an owl called across the grassland, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed as they settled for the night. It was a peaceful sound, the sound of home. Over the following years, their life continued to blossom. Their tinker business thrived as Penelope's reputation spread throughout eastern Oregon and into Idaho and Nevada. People would travel significant distances to have Penelope Grant fix their precious or damaged items, knowing her work was the best available. Quinn eventually left the ranch job to work full-time as her partner, handling customer relations and the business side while also doing many of the repairs himself under Penelope's patient teaching. When Thomas was 3, they welcomed a daughter, Catherine Martha Garrison, named for Quinn's mother and the woman who had become like a mother to Penelope. 2 years later came another son, Robert Herman Garrison, honoring the man who had helped them when they needed it most. Their cabin expanded with each child, Quinn adding rooms as needed until it was a proper house, comfortable and full of laughter. The children grew up in the workshop, learning the family trade as soon as they were old enough to hold a hammer safely. Thomas showed particular aptitude, his small hands surprisingly deft at detailed work. Catherine preferred the business side, charming customers and keeping meticulous records. Robert was still too young to show definite preference, but he loved watching his parents work, babbling questions in his toddler vocabulary. Quinn never forgot his brother, and Thomas Garrison's memory became a cherished part of their family story. Young Thomas grew up knowing he was named after an uncle who had died too young, a man who by all accounts had been kind and good. The silver watch sat on the mantel in a place of honor, and sometimes Quinn would take it down to show his children, telling them stories about their uncle and their grandmother and the family they came from. Penelope's father's tools remained in daily use, training another generation of tinkers. She would sometimes pause in her work and sense his presence, hearing his voice in her memory guiding her hands. She liked to think he would have approved of the life she had built, the family she had made, the way she had kept his trade alive and thriving. Herman and Martha became grandparents to the Garrison children in all but blood, watching them grow with pride and affection. When Herman's health failed as he approached 70, it was Quinn who took over much of the livery work, ensuring the old man could rest in dignity. When Martha died peacefully in her sleep at 73, Penelope wept as she would have for her own mother, and all the Garrison children mourned the loss of their beloved grandmother figure. On a summer evening in 1885, 12 years after Quinn had first walked into Penelope's firelight carrying his brother's broken coffee pot, they sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the blue mountains. Their children were playing in the yard, Thomas at age 12 supervising his younger siblings with responsible care. Catherine's laughter rang out as she chased Robert through the grass, both of them shrieking with joy. "You remember what you said to me that first night?" Quinn asked, reaching over to take Penelope's hand. "When I asked if you could mend people, I said I could only mend pots and pans," Penelope replied, smiling at the memory. "You asked what about people who could not sleep, whose hands shook, who felt trampled along with the body they buried. And you told me to sit down and tell you about my brother," Quinn said. "That simple invitation changed everything." "You changed everything," Penelope said. "You walked into my carefully controlled life and asked me to be brave enough to love you. To trust that partnership was not weakness but strength." Quinn lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with the same tenderness he had shown on their wedding night. "Best decision I ever made, asking to come with you. Best risk I ever took." "Best risk we both took," Penelope corrected. She leaned her head on his shoulder, perfectly content. "Look what we built, Quinn. Look what we made from grief and hope and stubborn determination." "A family," Quinn said simply. "A home. A life worth living." Young Thomas called out from the yard, asking if they could stay outside a bit longer, and Penelope called back permission. She watched her children play in the gathering dusk, these miracles born from love, and felt overwhelming gratitude for the broken cowboy who had asked her to mend his spirit. She had fixed his brother's coffee pot that long ago summer, but in the process, they had fixed each other, two broken people becoming whole together. Quinn pulled her closer, and she felt him kiss the top of her head. In the workshop behind the house, her tools waited for tomorrow's work. On the mantel inside, the silver watch kept perfect time. In the yard, their children laughed and played, safe and loved and free to be fully themselves. It was not the life Penelope had planned when she set out alone with her father's tools and a wagon full of damaged cookware. It was infinitely better. She had spent years mending broken things, never realizing she was broken too until someone had the courage to ask her to mend his heart. In healing Quinn, she had healed herself. In loving him, she had learned what it meant to be truly loved in return. The summer evening deepened into night, stars emerging one by one in the vast Oregon sky. Eventually, they called the children inside, tucking them into their beds with kisses and whispered goodnights. Quinn and Penelope prepared for bed themselves, moving through their nighttime routine with the easy familiarity of 12 years together. As they lay wrapped in each other's arms, Penelope thought about the journey that had brought them here, about the grief that had driven a cowboy to seek help from a traveling tinker, about the courage it had taken for both of them to choose love over loneliness. She thought about her father, who had taught her that fixing things was a worthy trade, never knowing it would lead her to fix not just pots and pans but also spirits and hearts. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Quinn replied, his arms tightening around her. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after. Forever, Penelope." She fell asleep smiling, safe in the knowledge that forever was a promise they would keep. Two people who had learned that the best way to mend what was broken was together, with skillful hearts and stubborn hope and love that refused to give up even when the darkness seemed complete. They had taken their broken pieces and forged them into something beautiful and whole. A family, a home, a love story written in the Wild West, where anything was possible for those brave enough to reach for it.